So it's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to Robin Osborne, who I've known, now I discover, for certainly recently for 20 years, and before that a bit, I expect. And our paths have overlapped in Oxford and Cambridge. Robin, I always start by asking when and where you were born.
So I was born in Colchester in 1957 and grew up in a small village called Little Bromley, which is to the east of Colchester. The village was tiny. I went to the village school. The village school had just 2 classes.
When were you born?
1957.
Ah, yes, you probably said that, but I missed it, yeah.
Yeah. The village school had just 2 classes, an infant class and a junior class. I had the very good fortune to be at the school at a period when the headmaster of the school was somebody who had realised that if they wanted to be headmaster of a large school, they should start by being headmaster of a small school and doing it well. So they came and they transformed this little village school and then moved on.
What was her name?
Hugh Heffer.
Hugh Heffer.
Mr. Heffer.
Yeah.
So Mr. Heffer was the junior teacher, and a ferocious woman called Miss O'Brien was my infant teacher. I can remember them very vividly.
Well, let's go back. I try and take people back to their antecedents, their ancestors, because I believe that we're shaped much before we're born. So you can go back. Some of my interlocutors go back to the Norman Conquest, but you don't need to go back that far. As far back, usually people go back to their grandparents, who they may have known. So, can you tell me something about any of your grandparents?
Yes. So I can go back to my grandparents on both sides of the family, but on my father's side, my father's grandfather was a farmer at Stoke-on-Ayland in Suffolk, and he had 2 daughters. When he himself got older than he wished to carry on farming, he settled his 2 daughters and gave them a choice of what they should have as their dowry, as it were. One daughter chose a farm, and my own grandmother chose a village shop. So took over the village shop in Little Bromley. She married somebody who was, I think, somewhat, as it were, beneath her station, my grandfather, whom I remember largely because in his retirement he made pin money by mending boxes for the local farmer for apples and so on. And I would stand for hours in the shed in which he did this, watching him as he alternately hit staples and hit his thumb with the hammer as he mended these boxes. So this was a village life, and they lived in a small semi-detached house within this village. My grandfather made his daily visit to the village pub, where there was a sort of standing order, and when he walked in the door they pulled him 2 pints. He went to the bar and he drank one of them and then took the other and sat down, and that was his life. On my mother's side, my mother's mother came from a very large family. She had in fact served in France in the First World War, having lied about her age. And that was in some ways the sort of high point of her career. She then married, had 2 children, and then her husband died.
When you say served in France, she's presumably a nurse or something? Yeah.
Her husband died while the children were very young, and she herself had to effectively go into service, so she cleaned other people's houses for the rest of her life in order to bring up these 2 children, including my mother. So that's the grandparents on both sides.
Yeah, so sort of lower middle class, roughly. And then moving down to your parents' generation, tell me something about, this is obviously more important.
Yeah.
What were they like?
So my...
I use the past tense. I presume they're both dead.
They are now both dead. Yes. They lived to their late 80s, early 90s. My father grew up in the village where I grew up in, as the son of the school the son of the shopkeeper, and was a clever man, and he went to Colchester Royal Grammar School, but then he was born in 1924, so 1939 he was 15, and what seemed most interesting was taking part in the war. And he actually failed his school cert, which was a ridiculous thing for him to have done, but then went into the Royal Air Force.
Very young, he was.
Yes, well, he spent a year or two working in the local factory before he went into the Air Force, in their laboratories, and that's what he then returned to after serving in the Air Force. One of the things he acquired from the Air Force was an ability to place people on the basis of their accents and dialect, at which he had an uncanny skill, that he would listen to someone on the television or the radio and he would say, just north of Leeds, or whatever. And you know, when one could discover whether this was right or not, it was almost invariably absolutely spot on. So he had various gifts which he took nowhere, I think, from that point of view, but he had quite a gift with people. And having started as a sort of lab assistant, he then worked up to be manager of a polystyrene plant. The factory then sold off its polystyrene manufacturing, and he moved over into being a transport manager, which enabled him to exercise his love of cars and vehicles and so on. He had, you know, this managerial role during the whole of my.
How do you think he influenced you? I mean, he wasn't obviously an academic or whatever, but were there things about his character that either pushed you towards academic things or against them?
Both parents very much encouraged. I have an older brother as well. Both encouraged me and my older brother in things academic. We were very much encouraged when at home never to be idle. And I think probably what I most learned from my father was never to be idle.
That is a part of your character, right?
I mean, he just was always doing something, and he had a garage workshop. You know, I think probably in 1962, when I was 5, he acquired a Rolls-Royce, 1928 Rolls-Royce, that had belonged to the local vicar, who had traded it in for a Mini. And this sat in the garage waiting for him to do it up for many years, and he fairly rapidly did everything mechanical that was needed, because that was what he was interested in. And then it sat there waiting for him to do the upholstery and so on, which he never did until I left home. Eventually he did, and got the whole thing out. But he always had something on the go of that sort, always doing something.
What about your mother? What sort of person?
So my mother had gone to the girls' high school in Colchester and had passed her school cert, and had then gone to work as a lab assistant in the same place that my father was working.
That's where they met.
And that's where they met. Yeah, Lawford Place it was called, and it was the research bit of a firm that went through various titles, but was called BX Plastics, I think, when I first knew it as a young boy. And that's where they met. And she never worked. She never took employment after marrying. She was a full-time mother, but she too was never idle. She had considerable artistic skills. Was a really skilled artist, though she didn't often exercise those skills, but it came out in needlework and all sorts of things around the house.
She was also very busy.
And she was invariably busy.
Were either of them of any religion? They weren't driven on by some Calvinist need to be busy?
No, neither of them were driven on by any sort of Calvinist views. But my my mother, having been brought up, I think, going to the local Methodist church a bit, she was brought up in Colchester, Mile End. Then, on moving to the village where I grew up, initially went to the village church along with my father's mother, who was a stalwart of the village church, and my father's grandfather had been church warden at the village church for many years and its organist. And then this was a very small village, and as you can imagine, the congregation at the village church was very small, and my mother rapidly fell out with one of the other ladies at the village church over some ridiculous arguments about, flower arrangements or whatever. And though she continued to get on very well with the local rector, whose visits of a fairly regular kind I remember from my youth, and who was an influence upon me, she transferred her allegiance to the local Methodist chapel, and so as a young boy I was taken along to the Methodist chapel and sat through innumerable long sermons.
So it's watered down Calvinism.
It was very watered down on the whole, yes.
So we started on your education, but just before that, I often ask people what was their first memory, not vague sort of trees waving above their pram, but a concrete memory, and at what age?
These things have got very complicated, haven't they? Because whether one remembers things, or whether one remembers the photograph of it, or whether one remembers, in my case, what I'm about to say, I'm not sure whether I can really remember my grandfather, my father's father, as it were, bouncing me up and down on his knee while he sang, or whether I can only remember the tape recording that my father made at the Christmas party when that happened. But that's one of my early memories.
How old were you, do you think?
I was probably 3, I would have thought at that point, something like that.
So he was a singer. He sang locals.
Well, not a serious singer. He had a repertoire of 2 or 3 songs which he could be persuaded to sing to small children. Otherwise, I think my earliest memories are probably of holidays. In fact,
where did you go?
We had a fairly regular pattern that we would go away for a week at Whitsun, as it used to be, and then a week in the summer. And I think the earliest one I can remember is probably going to Hastings in 1964, and then the Lake District in 1965.
So you're 7, 8.
Yes.
Yeah. Good. And what about around the primary school level, hobbies and interests? Are you a bird's egg collector or stamp collector or anything?
I did collect stamps, but my brother was a much more serious stamp collector than I was, and I just did it because that was what you were apparently supposed to do. We had I was brought up in a bungalow, but we had an orchard attached. And so, quite a lot of time was spent helping around with, raking up grass after my father had cut the grass in the orchard and those sorts of
so it was
things.
a fairly nature-laden...
Yeah, it was pretty open air, yes.
So we've moved on from your one fierce teacher and a very good headmaster at preparatory school, and then you took the 11 plus.
That's right.
And went to Colchester.
Yeah, went to Colchester Royal Grammar School. Yeah,
which is a very famous school. Tell me something about that.
I had a really wonderful education at Colchester Grammar School, and looking back at it, I think probably the sort of 1960s, early 1970s were virtually the heyday for that school, probably, in terms of its quality of teaching, because there were a very large number of teachers whom I now realise, had they been 10 years younger, would have ended up being employed as university lecturers in newly opened universities in the 1960s. But they were too old at the point when they were looking for jobs. School teaching was all there was, and Colchester Grammar School was a good school, and Colchester a pleasant place to live. I was taught by some really wonderful people. In my first year, I had as my form master a man called George Arthurson, who taught French. And
how do you spell that?
Arthurson. Rumours had it that he'd been part of the French resistance during the Second World War. I suspect that was not true, but that's what the pupils like to believe about him. But he'd never married, he lived with his sister, and he was known as Auntie, because he would invite his pupils back for tea on a Friday afternoon, where you got coddled eggs cooked by his sister. This was sort of eye-opening to somebody who actually, I hadn't spent any time, I think, visiting anybody other than a relative up to that point. And his French teaching technique was to start off by teaching us all a La Fontaine fable. So he went straight into French, and you were just expected to parrot it back. And he was an inspiring teacher, and he took a real interest. So I think I was taught by him only in my first year, and then perhaps 2 years later. But for years afterwards, he would send me almost illegible postcards from his summer holidays in France, and he must have done this to, I think, 50 or 100 students. So he was one very vivid presence, though whether I can trace his intellectual influence, I'm not quite sure.
Language? You're a good linguist.
Yeah, a certain to a certain extent, I think that will have come from him. It probably came much more heavily, however, I think, from my classics teachers, where I had a series of very good classics teachers and one extraordinary man, whom you know about anyway, but Arthur Brown, who was head of classics at the grammar school, had done greats in Oxford in the 1930s, was a man of very strong left-wing convictions, which I think probably also had some influence on me, and whose ability to not only master the language, but actually to remember all sorts of historical details from the ancient world, and who also thought that it was important that one knew about the art as well as about the literature. All of those aspects of his teaching had an enormous impact. He was a very gentle teacher, except occasionally he would just lose it at naughty boys in the back of the class, and for that reason he was always known as Bomber Brown, because there were moments when he would just bomb.
He had been fought in the war, presumably.
He had spent his war, I believe, bombing. Maybe this was another reason why it was called Bomber, bombing mosquitoes in Africa with DDT. That had been his part of the war effort as well.
That's good. Well, he's of interest to me, as you know, because he became very interested in Essex local records and wrote the standard guide to the record office or local records. And he then had a later distinguished career, didn't he?
Yes. So he retired from the grammar school the year that I left the school, having done A-levels. We'd always assumed that he was a man in his, at least in his 60s all the time we were there, but he must actually have been just 60 and took early retirement. The University of Essex took him on in the sociology department, because they didn't have a history department at that point, in order to direct a centre in local history. And that's what he did I think he was employed a third time or something like that, so he didn't have to retire. So for another 25 years, he had a career, and I went to his retirement conference when he finally did retire, aged 85. And I'd kept up with him up to that point. He was somebody who had an annual Christmas Eve party. And from the time one was in the sixth form, one would get an invitation, and all his ex-pupils knew that if it was Christmas Eve, they just turned up at Arthur's house in Lexton, and there would be food and drink and interesting company. And so they did, and so the company got more interesting all the time.
Wonderful. So you had, when you got to sixth form, you were moving towards the classics side.
Yes.
Presumably. Had you ever contemplated anything else? I mean, were you interested in the mathematics or science?
I'm quite proud that in my first year at the grammar school, I was the best scoring mathematician in the school.
Really?
But that was my high point in mathematics. I was a perfectly adequate mathematician after that. But my older brother was a much better mathematician than I was, so I always knew I was not a mathematician, really, by comparison with him. Certainly by the time I did O-levels, my enthusiasms were much more on the literature history side. One of the amazing things, looking back on it, that the school did was to decide that the English literature O-level was really pathetic and not worth entering boys for. So the school would simply self-certificate achievement in English literature. And I don't think they did this for very long, but they introduced this either in the year above me or in my year, and we were all required to come up with some project or other. So I didn't know what to do, but one of my close friends decided they were going to do something on T.S. Eliot. So I decided, well, if they were going to do Eliot, I would do Pound. So my own English teacher said, I don't know anything about Pound, but Chris Barlow, one of the other teachers, knows about Pound. So I went to see Chris Barlow, who brought in all his books about Pound and lent them to me. And I spent ridiculous amounts of my O-level year reading literature on Pound, reading all of Pound's poetry, the Guide to Culture, all those things, and writing a little sort of mini dissertation on aspects of Pound's cantos. So I was firmly headed in the arts direction. In the end, Arthur Brown had a very firm line about the values of classics. You did Greek and Latin, and you could do anything after that. And that's the line with which he convinced all the brightest boys in the school that they should take up Greek rather than Spanish or German when one had the possibility of another language in, I guess, the third year. And so it was clear that it made no sense not to continue both Greek and Latin if you're going to do either of them. And in the end, I also did ancient history, partly attracted by the fact that Arthur and the other teacher who had the greatest influence on me, a man called Terence Doherty, who was head of biology, had discovered that there was some way of doing an A-level which was half ancient history and half history of art. So Arthur taught the ancient history, or actually in my case didn't teach the ancient history because I was the only one interested in doing it, so he just sent me off to the library with a sort of reading list and some essay titles. And Terence Doherty taught the history of art.
How do you spell that name?
Doherty.
Right.
So he was a man who had come to the school, I think, when I was in the third year as head of biology. Big black bushy beard, riding a Lambretta scooter, very outgoing, walked around the school gardens with the school boa constrictor around his neck during the summer so that the boa constrictor could enjoy the sun.
This is not a real boa constrictor, this is...
No, this was a real boa constrictor.
Oh, it sounds like Stephen Hugh Jones.
And he hadn't taught me for biology. I didn't really know him at all, except as an eccentric, and until he taught me in the sixth form. and he was totally passionate about the history of art. He also worked with Michael Ayrton when he'd moved to, so Terence lived in Cone Engane, and when he'd moved to the Cone Valley, he'd made contact with Ayrton, who was by that stage getting too weak to do his own casting. So Terence went along and helped him do his casting, and when in due course I came to go out and visit Terence at home, there was an Ayrton Pythia sitting on the corner of the kitchen table. And Terry himself was a very considerable artist, and he liked painting copies of things, so his cottage again was full of largely, I think, sort of impressionist, post-impressionist paintings copied by him, as it were. And his teaching technique was simply to show one a large number of slides, and the next week there would be a test on them. And certainly that's where I received sort of training in visual memory, I think. And when half term came, he would take all those who were doing the subject, so half a dozen of us, lower sixth and upper sixth together, down by train to see exhibitions in London and have lunch at the British Museum Tavern. And again, I gained an enormous amount from that.
Sounds a very rich education. What about the other two aspects? Sport.
I was useless at sport. Having been to a primary school where there were 3 people in my year, team sports were not really something that the school could do. So I had no experience playing any team sport, really, and was hopeless. I could run, and so I ran cross country. Largely stamina rather than speed was my strength. So I ended up, I think, as captain of the cross-country team, and we were quite a successful school cross-country team. Other than that, I was not anti-sport. So in fact, I captained the third 11 at cricket. The third 11 was totally useless, and I was probably the most useless player there, but was thought to at least know enough to be reasonably sensible as a captain, I suppose. And I was secretary of the rugby team, which involved going to all their fixtures and running up and down as a touch judge. But that was about the limit of my sporting prowess.
What about music and drama?
Drama played almost no part. I took part in one school play, I think, Richard III, but in very minor role. I played a corpse when we put on a bit of Aristophanes' Frogs for a Greek day at another school, but that was about it. Music, I learnt piano from, I suppose, about the age of 5, and I continued with piano lessons until the age of 18. I worked my way through all the grades, and ended up, at least passing grade 8 piano. But like many, I think, pianists who are not particularly gifted, one then discovers that the world is full of people who really are gifted, and so although I have played off and on since for my own pleasure, I was never a good enough pianist to play any sort of performing role.
Does music play an important part in your life?
That links in, I guess, with religion. So I think that there is quite a lot of English hymnody, which is quite deeply sunk within me. And I find, as it were, phrases from hymns good to think with in a variety of contexts. But otherwise, music doesn't play a tremendous part.
You don't listen to music every day, or
no, I'm not
write my music or do anything?
No. I attend concerts from time to time.
And classical music that you like?
And for preference, I would listen to classical music on the whole.
Yeah. Well, coming back to religion, often it's around the time of confirmation. I don't know if you were confirmed or not, but at sort of 14, 15, that people suddenly become quite interested, at least I did, in religion. And then it either goes on or it doesn't go on. Tell me about where your Methodist roots got you.
Yes, well, from that point of view, I suppose I was a late developer by your standards. In as far as the attractions of Methodism seemed to me to be rather limited. And that, I think, was largely about the fact that the Methodist chapel operated as I think village Methodist chapels long had, though I suspect few still do, with a circuit of local preachers, many of whom were academically not very high-powered, though one or two were. There was a wonderful man called Frank Peck, I remember, who was simply a farm worker from the next door village, whose favourite biblical book was the Book of Job, but on the Book of Job he was just wonderful. And you know, it must be, it's great sadness in a way that there's no Macfarlane out there capturing, or was no Macfarlane out there in the 1960s capturing these effectively self-educated
should have been doing so.
Yes,
oral historian, but anyway.
As I alluded earlier, the man who was rector of the local parish, of Little Bromley and Great Bromley, when I was a young boy, I didn't have much to do with, but on some major feasts, as it were, we would go along to the parish church. And he was a different matter altogether. He was a very clever man, I remember, this is a rather silly story in a sense, I mean, why it should have stuck in my brain, but it does, that going along to a Good Friday service at the parish church, where we were part of a congregation of, I suppose, probably 5 or something like that, but he preached nevertheless. And I suppose I was 12, 13, so he knew I'd gone to the grammar school and would be studying Latin. And so suddenly in the middle of his sermon he turns and he says, you know, having said something, presumably something about death as the gateway of life, he then turned to me and said, Mors janua vitae, Robin. I did, I wasn't without an interest in religion, but I couldn't see anywhere within Methodism that was going to answer any of my questions. So I was confirmed, but only after coming to Cambridge, in fact.
Well, this is one of the themes that goes on through one's life. You were confirmed when you came to Cambridge, and then what was your religious trajectory after that?
Essentially, it's a classic, I think, much repeated pathway where you start in the middle or low in church terms and you gradually move up. And so I've certainly gravitated. The attractions of formal worship were much greater to me than the attractions of informal worship. And you know, to some extent, the greater degree of formality, the greater the attraction. So, you know, in King's, I attended the chapel, Michael Till as dean, and my girlfriend, who became my first wife, Catherine Rowett, had a high church background, and so when chapel wasn't operating, would drag me along to Little St Mary's church here. And Little St Mary's became my habitual place of worship. So I've become a bells and smells person. And I suppose if I were to justify my high churchmanship, it would be about as it were, powers of transformation. That a God who is active in the world is a God who has powers to change things, and what the centering of the High Church worship upon the Mass does is to put that moment of transformation absolutely central. The possibility that what has been made in one form can be turned into something else, and I guess that's a possibility that I grab onto in all circumstances, as it were. That I'm an optimist. I think it is possible for things to be changed, made better. There is a way of seeing one's way through what may be just routine to something that isn't routine.
This seems to verge almost onto the Catholic view. Where is the line? Because I've always assumed that Protestants, in essence, do not believe in transubstantiation and transformation and so on, and they're against miracles and this interfusion of God with our material world. As I'd assumed the line was Protestant Catholic. Sounds as if this is pretty blurred in your case.
It's extremely blurred. Yes, no, it's extremely blurred across the whole of the High Church, I think. That's a line which, having worked now on ancient religion as well, and on attempts, from antiquity onwards to draw the line between magic and religion, that's a line where repeatedly people think it ought to be possible to make a clear distinction and to stand on one side of that, and it just isn't. That in fact the material world and the non-material world are inevitably connected. One experiences that in one's own life. the psychosomatic is a reality, as it were, and I'm quite comfortable with that blurry line. I don't want to go too far over the blurry line, as it were. I don't think that the casting of spells is the attempt to do things by forms of words is at all a sensible way of thinking about how the world operates. But I do think that trying to keep that line sharp is also more or less impossible.
So it's on a continuum. Which reminds me of a line I often quote from R.G. Collingwood. Something along the lines, you'll know it, however much we can learn about Roman religion, there is no way in which we can now understand what the Romans meant by religion, or what Roman religion was like. And I quote that as an example of the anthropological problem of entering other worlds. What would be your comment on that in relation to Greek religion? Do you feel either that your experience in High Church, Anglicanism, or anything else has made you equipped to get inside the mind and attitudes and cosmology of the Greeks?
I mean, I think one has to think that one can get somewhere. Otherwise, if I thought I couldn't get anywhere towards understanding Greek religion, what would I be spending my time working on it for? And I suppose I'm a skeptic about perhaps this is going to emerge as a theme, my being a skeptic about the ability to draw strong lines, as it were, in general. But I'm a skeptic about whether the difference between my being able to understand your religious experience and my being able to understand the religious experience of a Greek is actually a significant difference. The sorts of evidence that I have available for your religious experience are very much like the sorts of evidence that I have available for the religious experience of at least some Greeks. And hence, in as far as we can understand anyone else's religious experience, I think there's no reason to think that the fact that they're from another culture is going to make it impossible for us to see the world like that. We have to work a lot harder. There are lots of things I can take for granted about you, probably some of them incorrectly, but in a way that there's very little one can take for granted about those who come from another culture. But I have a pretty strong commitment to the historian immersing themselves in the material as well as the literary and sub-literary culture of other people, and that takes one a long way.
Well, we might come back to it because we're both very interested in that, but let's go on with your career. You came to King's College, Cambridge, as an undergraduate?
I did, yes.
Why King's and why Cambridge? Except it's near Colchester.
So, yeah, all my classics teachers at school were from Oxford. And Oxford Greats was what you should really do if you were a classicist, as far as they were concerned. They were not, however, hostile to people coming to Cambridge. There was actually a closed Cambridge exhibition, I think, at Corpus, for instance. So there'd been a sort of sequence of Cambridge, of Colchester Royal Grammar boys going to Corpus. I had decided at some point during the sixth form and before I applied to university that I really wanted to combine classics and the history of art, carry on with both these strands. There was no history of art in Oxford at that point as an undergraduate degree. It obviously existed in Cambridge only as a part two, but that was sort of ideal for me. I could do some classics and then I could change the subject. So that was the primary motivation for referring Cambridge. And my UCAS entry to university had been schizophrenic. So it had been, number one had been Cambridge Classics, number two had been Courtauld Institute, History of Art, number three, I think it's somewhere else for classics, and number four had been Sussex for History of Art. My headmaster regarded himself as having a hotline to Trinity, Cambridge. So I was detailed off to go and see the Director of Studies in Classics at Trinity, a man called John Easterling, who ended up being university draftsman, who was a lovely man, and totally grey. So I saw him, I had a very pleasant chat, but without feeling tremendously excited by the experience. But my head of classics said, actually the person you should talk to if you want to do History of Art in part two is Caroline Elam, who was the daughter of a former headmaster of Colchester Grammar School, John Elam, and she was a research fellow at King's at that point. Must have been one of the first female research fellows here. And so I was sent off to see Caroline Elam and arranged to see Geoffrey Lloyd on the way. I was in fact late because the train from Ipswich had been cancelled. So I arrived late to see Geoffrey. We were supposed to meet just before lunch, I think. And I don't know whether it was just because Geoffrey was impatient or whether he'd always intended to do this anyway. But so he simply took me into lunch. And on the way, he bought me a pint in the bar, probably a half, I think, actually. But equally unthinkable these days. I think possibly partly because he only just stopped being senior tutor. and he liked the fact that everybody in college knew him. So going through the bar had an opportunity to maximise the number of people he could say hi to and who would say hi to him as he went through. Anyway, Geoffrey was a totally different sort of academic from John Easterling, and it was obvious on first meeting that here was someone who was lively and interested and probing and so on. So I saw Geoffrey, I went on and saw Caroline Elam, and it was obvious to me then that I should book King's as my first choice. And I then had the slightly bizarre experience that the other thing that my school headmaster was keen on doing was getting people at early offers. So one was interviewed in September, and you could. Some people were then given offers, and other people were only given offers after the second sort of batch of interviews in December, I think. So I received an early offer, which was wonderful. So I then, however, did the scholarship exam. Of course, all that was at stake was £60 a year, which even then wasn't very much. But nevertheless, I got myself a scholarship, which was a nice thing to arrive with.
What year did you come up?
I came up in 1976.
76. And I mean, there were many people in King's at that time who would be nice to talk about, but can you select 2 or 3 people, either your contemporaries or teachers or whoever, who influenced you or you remember?
So, yes. I was part of an extraordinarily large classics year, probably the largest year that the college has had, maybe since goodness knows when. There was one person who sort of changed in and out of the subject with great regularity, but at least when she was changed in, I think we were 13, 3 men and 10 women. Under the arrangements that prevailed then, King's didn't give awards to women so as not to poach them from the women-only colleges. So all 3 men had awards, and it quickly became obvious that all the 10 women would have had awards as well, had they been able to do. It was a very, very high-quality year in all sorts of ways, and full of interesting characters. This was also the moment when John Henderson had just arrived. He'd arrived, I think, in 1975 or even January 76. So we got John at his earliest, and that was an amazing experience, being taught by John. As in a different way was the experience of being taught by Geoffrey. Though their techniques were completely different. Geoffrey drove us all through our work by the sort of moral pressure. So he would give us a sheet with some possible essay questions and set us up to have a class one week and then write an essay for the next week. But he'd make it clear that actually really one ought to do 2 essays for the next week. But if one really could, one should do 3 essays for the next week. He had inherited, I think, from Patrick Wilkinson, and perhaps it went back even further than that, a practice where when we arrived we were given a printed sheet, which I would think of these days as sort of A3, but it must have been whatever the equivalent imperial sizes were then, which at the top said Greek authors, and then it listed Greek authors in 2 columns, and then Latin authors listed in the bottom half of the page, and you filled it in with what you'd already read. And at the beginning and end of term, you took it along, And Geoffrey wanted to know, as it were, what you'd added during the term or the vacation, and then he gave you a list of what you ought to add either during the term or the vacation. And it was always a list that then, halfway down the page, a line would be drawn, and he'd say, "Have you read Popper? You read Dante's Inferno?" and you acquired a list of further items which any well-educated person ought to know that weren't directly relevant to your... And again, the sort of moral pressure was that you jolly well sat down and you read this. And that worked with me. I read an enormous amount as an undergraduate, my education was rounded out, as it were, by Geoffrey in a very effective way. John, the experience of being taught by John was quite different. And with Geoffrey, one could understand what he was asking, even if one didn't know what the answer was. With John, you weren't ever quite sure where he was leading. Some of his comments, either made orally that stuck in one's mind, or indeed written on one's essays, it was only years later that I realised what it was he was getting at when he said this. But I think what I probably learnt from John was what the questions are to ask. It wasn't in some sense, it wasn't the answers that mattered. It was coming to see that those were the questions one needed to think about, and often to see that these were questions which the whole point of the question was that you couldn't answer this question. So those were the big influences, certainly in the first 2 years. As I said, I'd been due to change to history of art, which I never did, partly because one of Terence Doherty's great qualities as a teacher had been simply to bring in whatever it was that he himself had been reading. And he kept himself pretty well up to date on what was appearing. So I read T.J. Clarke, The Absolute Bourgeois, and so on, while still at school, and was very much attracted by the sort of thick cultural history approach to the history of art, only to quickly discover that actually that wasn't really what the history of art was as taught in Cambridge at that point. And I'd got too enmeshed in classics in any case, so I simply carried on with classics into my third year, at which point I was taught by Peter Garnsey at Jesus. With Peter there was a sort of rigour. I mean, this makes it sound as if Geoffrey and John weren't rigorous, but rigour wasn't what they were interested in some sense. Whereas Peter Garnsey was famous for an approach which said to the student, explicitly, "You've read this more recently than I have, you tell me what it's about." And I took a course on Rome and Italy, which he supervised me for, and we read some pretty obscure texts. And after the first supervision, you never went back, unable to engage in detail with those texts. And that was a tremendous education, and Peter then and since has been an inspiration as an ancient historian to me.
Again, a very rich experience, but we'll need to plod on or hurry on.
Yes.
You were a junior research fellow. Was that you started on a PhD presumably, or did you do a PhD and then become a JRF?
Yeah, I did a PhD. I had, in my final year as an undergraduate, I'd done this paper on Rome and Italy, which was about Rome and its relationships with the rest of Italy in the late Republic. I'd done a paper on Athens in the late 5th century and early 4th century that was taught by Moses Finley in his final year, and by Elizabeth Rawson. And I'd also done a paper on Roman Britain, which was an archaeology paper. Rather bizarrely, in that year, because someone else was on sabbatical, taught by Paul Halstead, who was a King's Research Fellow and a Neolithic archaeologist of Greece, not a Romano-British specialist at all, and by a man called Tony Swarforth, who was a historian of Roman Greece, who was temporarily out of employment and was hence brought in specially to teach this, even though this wasn't his topic. And what that did was get me interested in a topic which is hardly surprising that I would be interested in as a village boy, I guess, which is the relations between town and country. And it seemed to me that nobody had thought enough about how classical Athens worked, and how the town, the countryside interacted. City-states are always thought of as being sort of city and a little bit of territory around them, but actually, classical Attica is the size of an English county. There's an awful lot outside the relatively small classical town of Athens. And I knew that I wanted to do that, thinking about the archaeology as well as thinking about the history. I had thought that I ought to, move and do my doctorate elsewhere, so I went and saw the relevant people in Oxford, only to discover that, particularly on the archaeology side, they weren't really interested in these sorts of questions. And so I'd come back from that and asked Anthony Snodgrass, who didn't work on the classical period at all, but who had arrived more or less as I arrived as an undergraduate as Laurent Professor of Classical Archaeology, and was doing some very interesting work where he was trying to turn patterns within the material evidence into ways of thinking about the society. And he was happy to supervise me, and so I had a very productive, I think, doctoral relationship with him, where he, effectively took benevolent oversight and made sure that my sort of quantitative archaeology was up to snuff. Which was what particularly turned Anthony on, and I was fortunate enough then to get a junior research fellowship here in a bizarre year where the internal competition elected only 2 people, and those 2 people were both classicists, Simon Goldhill being the other one.
Interesting. Well, we're just coming to the end of this tape, I see.
Right.
And so rather than starting on another subject, I've got 1 or 2 ideas. You've always impressed me by your efficiency, Robin. You're chairman of the faculty board, you're now vice provost, and you do a lot of administration, but you seem to be able to do that effectively while being a really first-class scholar and producing a lot. How do you do it?
I think largely it's the always being busy element that it isn't that I someone who doesn't sleep at all. I'm not a Margaret Thatcher, but I do just keep at it, and I also find it often makes things more efficient, not less efficient, to be doing more than one thing at once. So the administrative things I often find just fit into the bits of the day when your brain is too dead to do a really original thought. And it's a question of sort of having things to do that will fill the suitable spaces that crop up. And I suppose I don't. One of the things I think people sometimes find is that I don't hang about very much around sort of waiting for things to happen. Probably I should do more of that. But actually, if a meeting's finished, and one goes off and does something else.
Do you divide up your time? I mean, do you keep certain times of the day for productive academic work?
No, not particularly. I'm conscious that I'm more productive in the mornings than I am later in the day. There's a sort of natural rhythm whereby marking undergraduate essays tends to happen in the evenings because that's when they've handed them in. And I do get slightly annoyed when they hand them in so late that you have to spend valuable morning time marking student essays. But other than that, I don't really police the organisation of my day.
On the sort of creative writing side, do you have any particular ways you write? I mean, do you write on a computer or hand, and do you get your best thoughts tramping around or listening to, not listening to music, but doing something else?
So I noticed when you showed me the transcripts of one of your other interviews, someone remarking that they were left-handed and their writing was illegible, and therefore they had at an early stage learnt to type. This is exactly my story. I am left-handed. My handwriting has always been terrible. I learnt to type at an early stage and typed some essays while I was an undergraduate. And I learnt to touch type properly. And so I then used typewriters so much that I got into being able just to write on a typewriter, and I've transferred that to a word processor. There was a time when I was writing my own dissertation where, because I needed to use Greek, I needed to use the typewriter that was in the old Museum of Classical Archaeology, which enabled one to do that. And I spent my mornings writing up footnotes on an old typewriter in the museum, my afternoons using the good typewriter because the secretary wasn't using it then, and then my evenings typing up my wife's dissertation because she at that stage didn't type and I did. So that was a point at which there was a very clear division of the day, but that was only a brief phase. But no, for many years I have done almost everything straight on the word processor. I sometimes make myself some handwritten notes, but usually
you
not.
Tend to make many revisions and do draft after draft, or just comes out fairly clean to begin with?
Usually it comes out fairly clean. I'm much keener on, as it were, questions than answers, and so I do regularly embark on writing things where I know what the question is but don't know what the answer is. And there are some times, happens less often now than it used to, where actually one discovers that one's intuition as to what the answer is totally wrong. And there was an occasion now many years ago where I wrote an abstract for a paper for a conference in which I said I was going to argue one thing. I then did the research properly and realised that exactly the reverse was true, so I delivered the paper arguing exactly the reverse. There was only one person who noticed. As I say, that doesn't often happen, but obviously when that happens, you can find yourself having set something up in one way, and then that just isn't the appropriate way, and you go back and you rewrite.
So turning to your work and skipping over your career in Oxford and then coming back here, pick out two or three of things that have interested you most and you think might be your contribution to this subject, or desert island discs of your own articles or books that you would like to be remembered for, and tell me about them.
That's not an easy thing to do. Indeed, I got myself in trouble. Well, I was going to say I got myself in trouble. It might be better to say that I lost myself a job by my answer to that question back in the 1980s, when I was asked in an interview here when I was a research fellow, an interview for a lectureship. I was asked what piece of work I was proudest of, and I answered that what I was proudest of was an article that I had just written, which was on the Parthenon frieze and the way in which the frieze was visible through the colonnade. And so although you go to the British Museum and you see a long stretch of frieze, actually on the building itself you never saw a long stretch. You saw little excerpts, and in order to see it you yourself had to process, and there was a relationship between the two of these. This was a piece which had sort of developed in teaching, and I remember in fact coming into lunch in King's one day and talking about this to John and Simon, and John himself, getting terribly excited, and that conversation really helping to formulate what I was writing. And it came out as a piece called The Viewing and Obscuring of the Parthenon Frieze, and I'm still very proud of it, and it would still be one of my top hits. And someone mentioned it to me about a month ago, so I know that there are other people out there who do think this is one of the pieces where I've contributed significantly. So that would be one piece I'm proud of. I will also mention a piece.
How did you lose the job for talking about it?
Well, certainly Keith Hopkins' view. Keith was one of those interviewing me on that occasion, and Keith's view afterwards was you had to talk about your major work. It couldn't be just an article that you tossed off on the side. It had to be what you were mainly working on, which of course was the town-country relations and turning the thesis into a book. That may well have been Keith covering up for all sorts of other reasons why it was a convenient way of explaining to me why I hadn't got the job, which I regard as extremely fortunate. I went off to Oxford. I had a wonderful time and a wonderful education from my colleagues in Oxford, so I don't at all regret not having had the job. It's only worked out positively for me. A second piece I'll pick out from exactly the same period as a research fellow, which was an extremely fruitful period, and I'll pick this out despite the fact, rather than because of the fact, that you feature in this, Alan. Right. So when I'd finished writing the dissertation, I thought I ought to get some articles out alongside the book, and B, that I ought to make sure that I engaged with some sorts of topics that were not simply, yet more town-country relations. And I got interested in who prosecuted whom and for what in classical Athens, which was the title I think I used when I first gave it as a seminar paper. And so looking at patterns of prosecution, relations between those who were prosecuting when one knows a bit more about them, and this turned into a paper in the Journal of Hellenic Studies called Law in Action in Classical Athens. And I remember coming into dinner and sitting next to you, and in the way that King's Fellows have, particularly I think with research fellows, but perhaps with other fellows as well, your basic question to me was, what are you working on? And I told you this. This would be 1984 probably, something.
I come back to King's End, yeah.
Something like that. And you were extremely helpful on the anthropological background. I think I'd probably already got as far as the TIV, because everybody gets as far as the TIV if they work on those sorts of questions. But you engaged with what I was asking. You helped me refine the ideas and see what the important things were. And that too has become, it became quite a controversial article in some ways. So the world of those who work in Greek law is basically divided between those who believe me and those who think this is completely mistaken in terms of the thesis that I argue. But that was a piece that, in the way that happens with one's academic reputation, it got me a name for someone who worked in law. So I had a name as someone who worked in town-country relations, a name as someone who worked in law. The Parthenon Frieze piece gave me a name for someone who did at least some stuff on sculpture. And essentially, for many years, I wrote almost nothing that wasn't a result of invitations, and the invitations tended to come out of those three areas, and so one ends up doing more work in those. So that would be some pieces from early in the career that I'm proud of. I'm also pretty proud of my last book, which was a book which took me 20 years to write. It started off as a project that was devised for an application for British Academy readership in the days when the British Academy would pay one for 2 years to do a research project in mid-career. And it was a project on Athenian vase painting, taking advantage of the very, very large corpus of surviving classical Athenian vases to think not about artists' hands, which is what had dominated the study of vase painting certainly until the 1970s, but thinking about subject matter and thinking about how the choice of subjects and the way that subjects are portrayed on vases might change over time within a relatively limited window from the late 6th century to the middle of the 5th century, which is a time when we knew lots of changing in Athens. It's the invention of democracy with Cleisthenes. The Persian Wars sit in the middle of that period. There's long been an artistic revolution called the Greek Revolution that takes place in this period and has been much discussed. And I wanted to see how the choice of what was shown might change over time, and how that might relate to what was going on. And so I sat in the archive of photos of Athenian vases in Oxford for 2 years with my pile of record cards in the old-fashioned way, classifying them not by painter but by subject. I now can't quite recover what my initial expectations about what I might find would be, though I must have put some hypothesis into the application to the British Academy. But what I did discover was that what changes is not that particular sorts of activities become more popular or less popular, so much as that the approach to showing activities changes from late 6th century, very early 5th century interest in action and competition and to some extent individualism, to a mid-5th century concentration where there's often no action. So athletes stop throwing their javelins, they stop running, and you just find them standing about in the gym with their stridules doing the sort of après gym stuff. Soldiers similarly stop fighting, they stop taking their armour out of, taking their shields out of their rapiers, and instead they stand pouring a libation with some female member of their family. You can't work out whether it's mother or sister or whatever. And so there's a whole sort of sea change in what the artists are interested in, where they move from, I suppose, exteriority to interiority. And what we are actually familiar with from classical sculpture, which is that classical sculpture sends you thinking about what's happening in people's heads, not about the actions that they're engaged in. It can be seen across the whole of Athenian painted pottery, and that, although it's in some ways not a surprising finding, perfectly fits with other things we know, is something which other people hadn't observed or documented in the same sort of way. So that too I would pick out as something which I hope at least is going to prove the foundation for other people doing interesting research.
Excellent. Well, we're just coming to the end, so I always say, like the officers when they're sending their troops over the top of the trenches, is there anything you would like to ask me, or is there anything else I should have talked about? Is there anything you would have liked me to ask you, or I've forgotten? I haven't asked you at all about your current family or anything else like that, but sometimes people say, I forgot to mention my 15 children. Or but is there something else I should have asked you, or is that okay for you?
I suppose the other thing that it might be interesting just to speak briefly about, and not least to speak to you briefly about, is the experience of being in Cambridge and then being in Oxford and then being back in Cambridge.
That would be very interesting.
Where, as I've intimated, I regard this exchange between the two, this sandwich of my life, as having been entirely positive from my point of view. I moved to an Oxford where the classics, and perhaps ancient history in particular, was in a golden phase, as I now realise, dominated by some really interesting figures who were at the height of their powers, and moved from what is a large faculty by the standards of, as it were, the rest of the world, but only half the size of Oxford, to a much larger faculty where there was much more sort of expertise on hand, and just tremendous encouragement to get involved and do things, and a very, very positive reception sort of across the piece. And also to this really interesting different attitude within Oxford where teaching really does dominate life or did in the late 80s and 90s, which is what I can talk about, life in Oxford, largely because most people were having to do a lot of it in terms of tutorials. And research very much pushed onto the back burner and not really talked about. Whereas in Cambridge, particularly as a research fellow, one was on one's toes all the time talking about one's research. So the concentration of energy was put in a different place in Oxford. But ironically, it was also a place which gave me tremendous opportunities which I wouldn't have had and haven't, to some extent haven't had, as someone, as a university teaching officer in Cambridge, because of the way in which in Oxford you have this large obligation to your college, but you have a very light obligation in terms of lectures. So I was only obliged to do 16 lectures a year, standard CUF university lecturer contract. And that meant that if someone came along and said, would you like to do an additional lecture here or there, or even, would you like to do an additional course of lectures here or there, you could say yes, in a way that, when you're doing 40 or 48 lectures, as people are here, you think twice before you add to that. And I had, halfway through my Oxford career, a group of female colleagues launched a Master of Studies in Women's Studies, and one of my classical colleagues drew my attention to this, and I simply sent a postcard in the way that one used to say, well, if you're doing this, I'm quite interested in the visual side. They latched onto this. I became the secretary to the Women's Studies Committee, the only man, nice bit of role reversal. And they then gave me opportunities to teach things which massively expanded my experience and so on. And I had a tremendously rich intellectual experience that way. So the different ways in which the two systems have worked have, for me, complemented each other wonderfully. And I to my mind, enjoyed the best of them at each career stage, as it were. I wouldn't be here today if I'd have been an undergraduate in Oxford, but I wouldn't have done what I've done in the last 20 years if I hadn't had the spell in Oxford itself.
Well, that's a very nice, cheery ending, carrying on the tradition of optimism, as you said.
Exactly.
Thank you very much indeed, Rowan.
No, thank you.